What fun to be with you folks tonight. It is a pleasure to be with you at the Capitalize Conference. I really wanted to talk tonight about this simple premise of bringing Christian faith to everyday work. So the talk that I've got for you tonight is called Choices and Consequences, Community and Contribution. I want to actually open up by sharing my faith testimony because God used my struggles at work to bring me to faith. And then God called me to bring Christian faith into the workplace. So my faith testimony is entirely wrapped up in my own story, personally, and with the At Work on Purpose ministry at large. I grew up in a happy but not holy household in Boulder, Colorado, on the front range of the Rocky Mountains in the U.S. My parents had both walked away from the church as kids for different reasons, so although I grew up knowing that there were people who believed in God and that there was a thing called religion, I had no personal experience of that in my household. But my parents were both English professors, so I spent most of my summers in Shakespeare festivals, sitting restlessly because what I was really interested in was driving cool cars. And English professors don't drive cool cars. We had a 1978 Honda Accord LX and a 1981 Subaru GL, and I wanted to drive Jaguars and Ferraris. So my first company was in high school. It was an auto detailing business called Chuck's Custom Car Cleaning. I was paid $25 an hour. This is in the mid-1980s. People would drive their cool cars to our house where I had all my supplies. I would meticulously clean them and then insist on driving those cars around town so that I could ensure that everything in the car was in good working order. My parents realized I was a budding entrepreneur, but they really didn't know what to do with me. The good news was that I excelled at school, so they were happy about that, and I ended up at Harvard University. This is a picture of me with my roommate Dan Jay at the dormitory where we lived, called Dunster House on the banks of the Charles River. Dan was an astrophysics major, but as fate would have it, he ended up going into the private sector, and he became a multi-millionaire because he invented cookies. And I don't mean chocolate chip cookies. I mean the cookies on the internet that track you everywhere you go. So when you're annoyed by that, that's the guy that made it happen. When I was at Harvard, I was living in the most cosmopolitan place I'd ever experienced. There were people there from all over the world, and they represented all the faith traditions of the world. Many of them became dear friends, and they still are. And over the years, I would get to know them and they would share their faith testimonies with me. What I found so interesting about all of them and their faithfulness was that they were grounded. When times got tough, they seemed to weather the storms of life better than I was. They'd all found God's truth. Their truths were contradictory, and truth doesn't contradict itself. And I was puzzled by that. But I put it on the back burner because the front burner was my emerging career. So I did sell that business that I had at Harvard, and I landed a job in general management at a multinational company called Procter & Gamble. It started up a corporate career for me, a blue chip corporate career that over the course of more than a decade took me from P&G to the Ernest and Julio Gallo Winery, where I was a director for varietal table wines. That's actually a picture of what Ernest looked like when I reported to him. And then at LensCrafters, where I was a general manager for the Eastern Third of the U.S. But during that season of my work life, I really started to struggle spiritually. And it started early. It started right out of the gate at P&G. First of all, my parents were horrified. They'd taken a second mortgage out on their house to send their son to Harvard. They expected that I would graduate and go into academia, and instead, I'd gone into greedy corporate America. I had moved to the parochial Midwest, And to add insult to injury, Procter & Gamble assigned me to toilet paper. About a week after I started my job, my mother called, and she doesn't have much velvet on her glove, and she said to me, "Chucky, you're flushing your career down the toilet." And I have to tell you, about 6 months into my new job at P&G, I was starting to wonder, much to my horror, if my mother might have been right. I spent 6 months traveling the country interviewing our consumer, female heads of household aged 25 to 54, to find out their habits and practices around toilet paper. What I learned was that White Cloud toilet paper was softer and thicker than they wanted to flush down the toilet. Procter & Gamble was frustrated because back in the day, we only had sales of about $59 million and we weren't meeting profit targets. And what we were learning was that the only way that we could make the product more profitable was a price increase. But we couldn't take the price increase directly, so we took it indirectly. I would wager that some of you are experiencing this right now in our current inflationary period. So my job, which got me promoted, was to work with manufacturing plants across the country. I took 30 sheets off of each roll, wound them more loosely, so it was the same diameter as before the sheet count reduction, took a tiny increase in the thickness of the paper, and then marketed it as new and improved. New because it had 30 fewer sheets, and improved because it was thicker. And I remember, like yesterday, walking home from work one day and thinking to myself, I'm about to get promoted for short sheeting the consumer. You know, many of us have a midlife crisis. I had a quarter life crisis. I went home to my apartment, my bachelor pad. I went out on the deck. I'm looking out at the skyline of Cincinnati, and I'm realizing that I am entirely depressed. I have absolutely no idea what to do with my work. Everybody told me I'd arrived. This was a famous company. It was considered a training ground position. I'd just been promoted, and I was as miserable as I'd ever been in my life. I knew I wasn't going to be able to motivate myself to take sheet count reductions for decades. But I had no idea what to replace it with, and I had no faith to inform any of my thinking. But I remembered just 6 months ago when I was at Harvard, those faithful friends who seemed to be more grounded during tough times. And I didn't know what that was, but I wanted that. So I made a decision that night that I was going to start studying comparative world religion and philosophy. And I did. So over the course of this corporate career, I went back to all the original source texts. I read the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, the Dhammapada, the Torah, the New Testament. In philosophy, I read the Analects of Confucius, the Dialogues of Plato. And I came to Christ in November of 1996 when the truth of the gospel went from my head to my heart. At age 31, a 30-something young working professional spending most of my waking hours at work, I was passionate to bring faith into every aspect of my life, and I was stunned as I started going to church regularly and getting involved in church ministry and observing that the vast majority of working Christians go to church on Sunday and work on Monday, separating faith and work. See, my sense of the church was largely informed by the early church, especially the New Testament. Take the book of Acts. All but one of the supernatural acts in the book of Acts take place in the marketplace. And the early church had no sense of separation between faith and work at all. And I pondered this thought, what happened to the church over the course of 2,000 years? And what keeps us today from living out Christian faith in the working world? When I was at Harvard, I'd done lots of research studies, so I decided to do one. I spent 2 years interviewing working Christians from all walks of work life. Some were new to work, some were close to retirement, private, public, social sector, men, women, all ethnic groups, socioeconomic conditions. What was striking as I began to synthesize what I was hearing is that over and over again, regardless of the kind of work, regardless of the industry, that there are 5 overarching struggles that we all face in the workplace. And for each one of them, there is a spiritual solution. And it all boils down to choices. The insight that we build our witness at work, we build our legacy at work, one choice at a time. As the years passed, I began to understand how to verbalize these 5 choices in a way that could become an equipping tool. This is now one of the training tools that we use with the At Work on Purpose ministry to help guide Christians to become faith active at work. The first question, the first choice, will we isolate or integrate our Christian faith at work? A great example of this is Abraham Lincoln, a president in the U.S. who made an executive decision in his job to lead the U.S. into a civil war because he could not reconcile his Christian faith with his executive realities. He looked out at the country. He heard scripture saying that all people are created in the image of God, but the federal government was tolerating slavery. The character quality here is to be dedicated. Lincoln was so dedicated to this premise that he lost his life. Second area of choice. Will we resist or respond to God's vocational call on our lives at work? A great example of this is Susan Boyle, who was discovered in 2009 on Britain's Got Talent. She came up on stage, there's a ticker up top that says unemployed, age 47, and she timidly steps forward. She steps out and the world discovers how beautiful her voice is. It turns out, backstory, that Susan grew up in a Catholic parish with a beautiful voice. Her friends and family kept encouraging her to sing for a living, but she was afraid. And so she kept approaching a musical career tentatively. But on that day, she exhibited the character quality of courage, and the rest is history. We're going to come back to Susan's story later. That is not one of my slides. Lucky for you guys, this has been indelibly ingrained in my head, regardless of whether or not we have slides. But for the folks in the back, in the event that you're able to figure out what's happening there, let me know. Let me go forward one more. No? Oh, well, that's interesting. Okay. Well, we're going to make this work. You're just going to have to roll with me on this one. Okay, so we've covered the first choice. Are we going to isolate or integrate? The second choice, are we going to resist or respond? The third area of choice, will we compromise or commit to kingdom standards at work? And VW is a great case study for this because in 2015, they experienced what we all came to know as Dieselgate. What happened was that VW's software engineers rigged the software in the cars to indicate that they were passing emission standards when they really weren't. This was caught in the US in September of 2015, and eventually this scandal went global. To date, VW has paid over $34 billion in fines. I would suggest to you that VW has lost more than that in their brand equity. Why? Because when you think about Volkswagen, the people's car, it's supposed to stand for transparency, simplicity, authenticity. But this decision was anything but. And honestly, as a Christian, I watched all this happen, and as a car guy, I was especially interested, but I was thinking to myself, where was the voice of the church at VW to say that your yes should be a yes and your no should be a no? The character quality here is to be honorable. Then we have a fourth area of choice. Will we sit back or serve the people around us at work? In the U.S., and I suspect Canada may be similar, congregations on average are about 100 people or less. But the average working Christian has a sphere of influence of over 300 people, 3 times the size. If we could start to see the people around us at work as our mission field, it could transform the way we see our work. Every one of us has a position description and tasks to perform, but if we started to understand that we are ambassadors of reconciliation in the place where we work, that we have an opportunity to minister to the people around us at work, and that God affords opportunities all the time. One example that really touched my heart was my wife, Gerald, a mechanical engineer who rose through the ranks at Procter & Gamble where I met her. She eventually became a manager and a junior executive. And she approached Procter & Gamble and she asked for permission that once a quarter she could take a morning and take her entire staff out into the community for volunteer service. P&G said yes. One day, my wife took her staff to Crayons to Computers, a free store for teachers, and I decided to tag along. I was just curious to see what was going to happen. So we pull up at this nonprofit. There's a semi-truck that had just arrived, and our job was to unload all of these free supplies for kids that couldn't afford them and put them in a warehouse on shelves. These engineers from my wife's department who came there that day looked at the entire system for inventory and warehousing, and they were appalled at how antiquated it was. They spent the next 6 months redesigning the entire thing, and there is now a state-of-the-art inventory and warehousing system that Crayons to Computers continues to use to this day. Because my wife just decided to ask permission to harness some resources right in front of her in the place where she worked and use them for the common good of the community where we work and where we live. So many of us have this opportunity also, and the character quality here is to get involved. It's to be involved. And then, the fifth and last area of choice, will we spend or steward the resources God's entrusted to us? Any of us in the workplace are told that we own things. But Scripture makes it clear that God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. Everything under the sun belongs to Him. We don't own anything, yet we steward everything that God's entrusted to us. And I can tell you in the workplace, we make very different decisions when we choose on the basis of being a steward or an owner. Great example of this is Eli Lilly, a business owner in the U.S. that launches what comes to become Lilly Pharmaceuticals, which is now a multinational firm with a philanthropic arm that Eli Lilly, as a Christian, wanted to establish that gives away millions of dollars for Christian ministry work around the U.S. and ultimately internationally as well. These are 5 areas of choice that we face every day, no matter what kind of work we do. And I can tell you, it's exciting when we see just one working Christian that has a profile like that. Just one Christian who goes to work and says, I'm going to integrate rather than isolate my faith at work. I'm going to respond rather than resist God's vocational call for my work. I'm going to commit to kingdom standards rather than compromise. I'm going to serve the people around me at work rather than sit back. And I'm going to steward God's resources for the common good of the community rather than just spend them on myself. It's inspiring to see just one working Christian that makes choices like that. Dream with me. What would it look like if every Christian in the work world made choices like that? We would transform our world. choices and consequences. Now I want to talk a little bit about community and contribution. Years ago, I read a book that fascinated me called Prayer Evangelism by Ed Silvoso. It recounts a story. It's actually an interesting case study of city reaching in 1988 in Resistencia, Argentina. This is a city of 400,000 people that had a spiritual stronghold of witchcraft. And over the course of about a year, tens of thousands of people came to Christ because of a strategy that Ed Silvoso's ministry developed called prayer evangelism. It's pulled directly out of Luke chapter 10. This is where Jesus is sending out the 70 disciples in work teams of 2 to go to surrounding towns and villages and share the good news of Christ. And in the New International Chuck version, when you show up in these towns and villages, you give people a warm greeting. If they're not nice to you, you dust off your boots and move on. But if they are nice to you, you hang around and fellowship with them. You build relationships with them. And then as you get to know them better, you find out what their felt needs are and you begin to minister to those felt needs. You heal the sick. And then when they begin to ask why you cared so much about them to go the extra mile, you tell them that you have gone the extra mile for them because Jesus went the extra mile for you. To proclaim Christ is the reason for your motivation. Jesus was providing here in Scripture a 4-step process for spiritual engagement in a pre-Christian world. I would suggest to you that these 4 steps are just as relevant in what for many of us is an emerging post-Christian world. We took this premise of prayer evangelism within our At Work on Purpose ministry and we framed it out a little more completely. We contextualized it for work. We developed a tool that we call return on involvement. It's a play on return on investment in the private sector. Imagine a spiritual engagement grid where the rows are prayer evangelism, bless, fellowship, minister, proclaim, and then we have added a 5th, which is to disciple. When we get the privilege of leading somebody to the Lord through work, we shouldn't just send them to a local church and hope that they get discipled. It's our opportunity to be a Paul to their Timothy in the place where we work. They may spend an hour a week at church, but we spend 30, 40, 50, 60 hours a week with them. Right? What a difference that could make. But think for a minute what it would look like if all of us were using a process like this across a set of stakeholder groups. These are the columns in this grid. Imagine if I'm a teacher, for example. So my stakeholder groups would be my students, the parents of the students, the other teachers, the administrators, might be the school employees at large, maybe the Parent Teachers Association. When you start to fill out this grid, and you don't have to fill out every cell, but when you start filling it out, you start to see how many practical opportunities there are every day to simply be a blessing to somebody. You know, maybe it's just giving a warm greeting to the receptionist when you walk in the office at the beginning of the day, or to fellowship with people. Maybe on your shop floor you set up a little system for yourself where you go out to lunch with every person over the course of each 6 months. To minister to felt needs, it might be rebooting a computer or fixing a PowerPoint presentation when something isn't going right. And then to proclaim Christ when you have an opportunity to speak because you've earned the credibility to speak. Now let's put those 2 together. What would it look like if everyday working Christians went to church on Sunday and then when they went to work on Monday were conscious of these 5 areas of choice all through the day? Think about it. We make choices at work all the time. And if you stop and reflect on the choices you make, you will find spiritually over and over again that those choices fall in these categories. When we start to become more choiceful, so that we can become more faithful. And then simultaneously, we begin to develop our own strategy for return on involvement, to store up treasures in heaven where moth and rust don't destroy. Imagine how powerful that is. These are practical how-to tools, because I can tell you what I hear over and over again in the Faith at Work movement is that we're getting better at telling the why. Why should we do faith at work? Because God tells us to in lots of different ways. What does it look like? It means understanding the theology of work. But how? How do we go from concept to practice? These two tools are such a simple way to get started. So we printed them inside of your pamphlets. There's a page in there that has these. And you're going to be able to hopefully use these as you leave here tonight and going forward. You know, what would your ROI grid look like? How could you approach your choices at work differently next Monday morning? As I close out tonight, I'd like to return to Susan Boyle. Sometimes someone like me can stand up here and speak from the head and tell stories and describe concepts. But other times, what really matters is that you experience something that touches your heart and speaks the truth. And when Susan Boyle sang in her audition at Britain's Got Talent, that's exactly what happened. So what we're going to do is watch that audition. I know that many of you may have seen this before, but I want you to watch it tonight if you've seen it before with a different view. I want you to notice that ticker up at the top that says unemployed, age 47. I want you to notice how nervous she is when she walks out on stage. I want you to notice how the audience ridicules her as she's getting ready to sing. And then I want you to listen to the commentary of the judges afterwards and how they reflect on what it took for her to respond to God's call for her to be on that stage. Let's watch this video.
Hi, what's your name, darling?
My name is Susan Boyle.
Okay, Susan, where are you from?
I am from Blackburn near Bathgate, West Lothian.
It's a big town.
It's a sort of collection of, villages. I had to think there.
And how old are you, Susan?
I am 47. And that's just one side of me.
Okay, what's the dream?
I'm trying to be a professional singer.
And why hasn't it worked out so far, Susan?
I've never been given the chance before, but here's hoping it'll change.
Okay, and who would you like to be as successful as?
Elaine Page.
Elaine Page.
Like
What are you going to sing tonight?
I'm going to sing I Dreamed a Dream from Les Miserables.
Okay.
Big song.
Yeah? Yes.
I dreamed a dream in time gone by. When hopes my life was living.
You didn't expect that, did you? Did you? No.
I dreamed that love would never die. I knew that God would be forgiving. I was young and unafraid. When
very much, Susan. Piers.
Without a doubt, that was the biggest surprise I have had in 3 years on this show. When you stood there with that cheeky grin and said, I want to be like Elaine Page, everyone was laughing at you. No one is laughing now. That was stunning, an incredible performance. Amazing. I'm reeling from shock. How about you two? But
I am
Can't
so
believe it.
thrilled because I know that everybody was against you. I honestly think that we were all being very cynical, and I think that's the biggest wake-up call ever. And I just want to say that it was a complete privilege listening to that. It was brilliant.
Susan, I knew the minute you walked out
Oh, Simon!
on that stage that we were going to hear something extraordinary, and I was right.
Not a lot of tosh.
Susan, you are a little tiger, aren't you?
Oh, I don't know about that.
You
I don't know
are.
about that.
Okay, moment of truth. Piers, yes or no?
the biggest yes I have ever given anybody.
Amanda?
Yes, definitely. Brilliant. Amanda, you too!
Susan Boyle, you can go back to the village with your head held high. It's 3 yeses.
That's what it looks like to be at work on God's purposes. And I pray that each and every one of you settles for nothing less. Thank you very much.